The wind was a thief. It stole the warmth from a man's bones and the sound from the air, leaving only a low, mournful hum that vibrated through the floorboards of the old ranch house. Elias Thorne felt it in his teeth. He stood on the porch, a mug of coffee growing cold in his calloused hands, and watched the gray dawn spill over the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains. This land was a testament to endurance, a harsh beauty carved by ice and wind, and he had come here to be scoured clean. The ranch wasn't a retreat. It was penance. Every warped board in the barn, every stretch of rusted wire in the fences, held a memory of his wife, of his little girl. Their laughter was a ghost in the whisper of the cottonwoods, their absence a physical weight in the vast, empty sky. He had come back to the place where his life ended, to live out his days in the quiet company of their ghosts. A flicker of movement near the water trough drew his eye. Not a deer, not a coyote. The shape was wrong. He set the mug down, his body tensing with a half-forgotten instinct. The stillness of his life had been a carefully constructed dam against the past, and he guarded it fiercely. He pulled on his worn leather coat and walked out into the biting morning, his boots crunching on the frosted earth. The tracks were strange, small, and unshod, leading from the trough toward the cavernous gloom of the barn. Human, a child by the size of them. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced the dull ache of his grief. He followed the tracks, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the hunting knife on his belt. The barn doors groaned as he pushed them open, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. The air inside was thick with the scent of old hay and dry rot. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light cutting through the warped siding. "Hello!" His voice was a rusty tool, and used to anything more than a murmur to himself or a curse at a stubborn fence post. No answer. Only the scuttling of a mouse in the walls. He scanned the ground floor, the empty stalls, the pile of old saddles that smelled of his father's sweat. Nothing. Then he looked up. In the shadowed loft, a pair of eyes gleamed back at him. They were wide, feral, and filled with a terror so profound it was almost an animalistic state. He held up a placating hand and took a slow step forward. A low growl, guttural and inhuman, vibrated from the shadows. He froze. It was a young woman or maybe a girl on the cusp of it. She was huddled in a nest of loose hay, dressed in a simple dark dress that was torn and caked with mud. Her hair was a wild, matted tangle, and her face was smudged with dirt, but it was her posture that stopped his heart. She was poised on all fours, her knuckles pressed into the hay, her body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt or to fight. He saw the intricate, starburst scars that patterned her forearms, pale against her skin. They weren't accidental. They were deliberate like brands. He slowly, deliberately, unbuckled his knife belt and let it drop to the dusty floor. He held his empty hands out, palms forward. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said, his voice softer now, gentler. "You're safe here." The girl only watched him, her breathing a series of short, sharp huffs. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, never left his. He knew then that calling the sheriff was not an option. You didn't cage something this broken. You gave it space to heal or to flee. He backed away slowly, his movements measured, until he was out of the barn. He closed the doors softly, leaving her to the shadows. That was the beginning of the silence. For 3 days, he lived with the knowledge of the wild thing in his barn. He would leave a plate of food, bread, a piece of smoked venison, an apple, on a crate just inside the door, along with a canteen of fresh water. He would announce his presence with a low cough, set the items down, and retreat. Hours later, when he checked, the food would be gone. He never saw her take it. He just saw the empty plate. He worked on his fences, the repetitive motion of stretching wire and pounding posts a familiar bomb. He could feel her watching him from the dark maw of the loft. He didn't look, didn't acknowledge her gaze. He just worked, a solitary man against a vast landscape, a silent audience in his barn. On the 4th day, the rain came, a cold, relentless drizzle that turned the ranch to mud and soaked him to the bone. He worked until dusk, his old joints aching. When he returned to the house, He built a fire in the hearth, the crackle and pop a welcome companion. As he sat staring into the flames, a shape materialized in the doorway to the kitchen. It was her. She stood dripping on the floorboards, shivering, her thin dress plastered to her frame. She looked smaller, more fragile, stripped of her feral defenses by the cold. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just looked at her, then gestured with his chin toward the fire. She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes darting from him to the flames to the door, calculating escape routes. Then, with a fluid, silent movement, she crossed the room and huddled on the stone hearth, as close to the fire as she could get without touching it. He rose slowly and fetched one of his wife's old quilts from a chest at the foot of his bed. It still smelled faintly of her, of lavender and sunlight. The scent was a fresh stab of pain, but he pushed it down. He walked over and gently draped the quilt over the girl's shaking shoulders. She flinched violently at his touch but didn't run. She just pulled the fabric tighter around herself and stared into the fire, her jaw clenched. He sat back down in his chair. They shared the space, the warmth of the fire a fragile truce between them. He noticed she made small, clicking sounds with her tongue, a constant, quiet rhythm. It wasn't a nervous habit. It seemed like a form of communication, a language meant for an audience of one. Her name was Alara. He didn't know that yet. He knew only the animal in her eyes, the deep well of her trauma. He started talking to her, his voice a low rumble that filled the quiet room. He didn't ask questions. He told her about the ranch, how his father had built it with his own hands. He told her about the mare, Willow, who had been his daughter's, and how he still kept her stall clean. He spoke of his wife, Sarah, and how she could make anything grow in the stubborn soil. He was excavating his own heart, laying the pieces out in the firelight. He expected nothing in return. She never spoke, but she listened. He could see it in the slight tilt of her head, in the way her frantic energy would calm when he spoke of his daughter, Lily. Days turned into a week, then two. She began to move about the house, always silent, always watchful. She would wash the dishes he left in the sink, her movements economical and precise. She swept the floors. One afternoon, he came in from the cold to find she had taken his mending basket and was stitching a tear in his coat with small, perfect stitches. A strange, painful lump formed in his throat. It felt dangerously like hope. He started leaving Lily's old picture books on the table. She would trace the words with her finger, her brow furrowed in concentration. She couldn't read. The realization struck him with a profound sadness. Who was this girl, and what world had she come from that had left her so utterly untethered from this one? The answer came one moonless night, carried on the wind. It was a sound that did not belong in the mountains of Wyoming, a series of whooping, laughing cries that raised the hair on his arms. It sounded like the devil's own chorus. Inside the house, Alara went rigid. She dropped the plate she was drying, and it shattered on the floor. She didn't seem to notice. She stood frozen, her head cocked, listening. A low, desperate whine escaped her lips, a sound of pure anguish and terrifying recognition. Elias grabbed the rifle from its rack above the mantel. He moved to the window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. The sound came again, closer this time. He had heard it before on television documentaries. Hyenas. It was impossible. Yet the sound was undeniable. He turned to look at Alara. She was at the door, her hand on the knob, her knuckles white. She looked back at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear in her eyes. He saw a plea. "Don't," he said, his voice a harsh command. She didn't move. The laughing cries echoed one last time, further away now, and then there was only the wind. The spell was broken. Alara collapsed, folding into herself on the floor, her body racked with silent sobs. He went to her, kneeling beside her, and for the first time, he put a hesitant hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch away. She leaned into the touch, a silent surrender. The mystery of her deepened. The hyenas, for he saw them himself 2 nights later, 2 lean, spotted creatures watching the house from the ridgeline, were not just a threat. They were a part of her story. They had followed her. She would go to the fence line sometimes, a silhouette against the twilight, and make a soft, chuffing sound, a perfect imitation of the sounds he'd heard them make. They would answer from the shadows. They were her pack, her captors, her family. He began to piece together a horrifying tapestry. The scars, her inability to speak, her animalistic grace, the strange sect-like dress she wore when he found her. She hadn't been raised by hyenas. She had been raised with them as an object lesson, a tool of fear. The world she came from was one of unimaginable cruelty. Their fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday. A black truck, stark against the muted browns of the landscape, rumbled up the long dirt drive. Elias was on the porch, oiling a saddle, Alara inside, out of sight. A man got out of the truck. He was tall, dressed in the severe, plain clothes of an old-order Amish or Mennonite, but the cut was too fine, the boots too new. He had a handsome, weathered face and a smile that didn't reach his cold, blue eyes. "A good day to you," the man said, his voice smooth and resonant, like a preacher's. "I'm looking for some help. My name is Jedediah." Elias didn't stand. He just watched the man approach, his thumb rubbing a worn spot on the saddle leather. "What kind of help?" "I'm looking for a lost member of our community, a young woman, troubled in her mind. She wandered off some weeks ago." He described Alara perfectly, down to the color of her eyes. "She is special. A lamb who doesn't know she belongs to the flock. She has a wild spirit that needs a firm shepherd." "Haven't seen anyone," Elias said flatly. Jedediah's smile widened, but it was a predator's smile. "Are you certain? She is drawn to desolate places, and she has a unique bond with God's wilder creatures." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Some would say an unholy one. We use God's laughing hounds to remind the flock of the chaos that waits for those who stray from the path. She was their keeper. She thinks they are her kin." The blood in Elias's veins went cold. He finally understood. This was the shepherd. This was the source of the scars. "Like I said," Elias repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Haven't seen her." Jedediah's gaze drifted past Elias, toward the house. For a fleeting second, a curtain in the window moved. Jedediah's eyes locked onto it, and his smile became genuine, triumphant. "I see. Well, the Lord works in mysterious ways. He will guide her home." He tipped his head. "I will be back. The stray must be returned to the fold." He walked back to his truck and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating sense of dread in his wake. That night, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall. By morning, it was a full-blown blizzard. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, piling drifts against the house and the barn, erasing the road, cutting them off from the world. It was a fitting backdrop for the coming war. Elias checked his rifle, his shotgun, and the pistol he kept in his nightstand. He barricaded the back door and shuttered the windows. Alara moved around him, a silent shadow, her eyes wide and dark. She wasn't frightened. She was preparing. She sharpened the kitchen knives on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a counterpoint to the raging wind. The tension in the small house was a living thing. They waited. The attack came just after dusk, under the cover of the storm's fury. 2 sets of headlights cut through the swirling snow, parking 100 yards from the house. Jedediah and 2 other large men, clad in dark coats, got out. They moved with purpose, carrying heavy clubs. And behind them, loping through the snow, were the 2 hyenas, their laughing calls snatched away by the wind. They weren't Jedediah's allies. They were his weapons, driven by fear and hunger. The men smashed the front window. Elias fired the shotgun through the opening, the roar deafening in the enclosed space. One of the men screamed and went down. Jedediah and the other one came through the door, low and fast. The fight was brutal, a chaotic explosion of violence in the flickering firelight. Elias was strong, hardened by a life of labor and an old war, but he was 1 man against 2. The second man swung his club, catching Elias in the ribs. He gasped, pain flaring, and stumbled back. The man raised the club for a final blow. Suddenly, Alara was there. She moved with a speed that was utterly inhuman, a small carving knife in her hand. She didn't scream, didn't hesitate. She drove the knife into the man's thigh, twisting it. He bellowed in pain and fury, turning on her. At the same moment, from outside, came a new sound. It was Alara. She let out a high-pitched, piercing cry that cut through the storm. It was not a sound of fear. It was a command. It was the call of an alpha. The hyenas outside, which had been circling nervously, responded instantly. They were Jedediah's tools of fear, but Alara had been their world. They recognized their true master's cry of distress, and they recognized the scent of the men who had tormented them. A snarling, spotted blur launched itself through the broken window, landing on the second man's back, its powerful jaws closing on his shoulder. The man shrieked, a sound of pure terror. The second hyena came through the open door, a low, rumbling growl in its chest, its eyes fixed on Jedediah. Jedediah stared, his mask of pious control shattered. He saw his living weapons turned against him. He saw the wild thing he thought he had tamed, standing with a bloody knife in her hand, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury he had never imagined. He backed away, out the door and into the storm, straight into the path of the first hyena as it finished with its victim. Elias, struggling to his feet, grabbed his rifle and followed him out. The final confrontation happened in the barn, the only place to escape the wind and the teeth. Jedediah was cornered, his sanctimonious words gone, replaced by frantic, terrified prayers. "She is an abomination," he shrieked as Elias advanced on him. "A beast in the skin of a girl." "No," Elias said, his voice ragged, his ribs on fire. "She's just a child. And you're the monster who hurt her." The fight was short and ugly. It ended with Jedediah lying broken in the hay where Alara had once hidden. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. By morning, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the world buried in a pristine blanket of white. The sheriff's deputy, a young man with wide eyes, took Elias's statement. It was self-defense. The evidence was overwhelming. The story that unraveled about Jedediah's community was a dark tale of a cult, of abuse and isolation, hidden under the guise of faith. They found records, other victims. The world now knew of the monster. When the authorities were gone, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. The two hyenas, their strange duty done, had vanished with the storm, melting back into the wilderness that was their proper home. Elias sat at the kitchen table, taping his ribs. Alara came and stood beside him. She reached out a hesitant hand and gently touched the bandage. Her fingers were warm. He looked up at her. The feral, haunted look was gone from her eyes. In its place was a deep, quiet strength, and something else he hadn't seen before. Gratitude. Peace. "Elias," she said. Her voice was a soft, unused thing, a quiet rasp. It was the first word she had ever spoken to him. He felt the dam inside him finally break. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He had come to this place to be alone with his ghosts, to serve out a sentence of grief. But life, in its brutal and beautiful way, had found him. He reached up and covered her hand with his own. Outside, the sun glinted off the fresh snow. The mended fences of the ranch stood strong, no longer the borders of a prison, but the outlines of a sanctuary. They were a broken man and a wild girl, two survivors who had found, in the heart of a storm, the quiet beginnings of a family.